What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning riding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. We start Poetry of Lent on Ash Wednesday by putting ashes on our foreheads. This should not be to demean ourselves, insult ourselves, or frighten ourselves, but to celebrate the reality of what we are, God's children in the form of men and women. We are made of dust. Some even say stardust. But that is a miracle rather than a misery. We are fashioned from the earth, but so are the Rocky Mountains, the pyramids of Egypt, Chartres Cathedral. We accept and we admit to being earthenware crockery, so that we can begin the challenging task of making it live forever. So we have to give up nonsensical ideas about ourselves. We are not Superman or bionic woman. We are weak but wonderful, fragile but potentially fantastic, vulnerable but victorious. We hold the treasure of eternal life in earthenware jars, as Corinthians 4:7 puts it. And Lent is the time to realize this full potential. Just like pruning in springtime to promote better growth in summer. If we give up something for Lent, it's not to annoy ourselves, punish ourselves, prove ourselves. We give up and renounce whatever is preventing us from being who we really are. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. Whether you have never heard these words before, or whether you have heard them 100 times, there is a power about them which does not depend upon rational understanding, a disentanglement of meaning. Poetry is its own persuasion. It is a language, an idiom, a prophecy of its own. The poem that I read at the beginning is written exactly 100 years ago now, in 1922. And it is one of the great poems, some would even claim the great poem of the 20th century. We in Ireland might claim that status for one of our own. The Second Coming by Yeats, which was written 2 years earlier, might come to mind. turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Poetry arranges human experience into archetypal molds. Both these poets use archetypal Christian imagery to describe the 20th century as a via crucis, a way of the cross. Roger Casement was the British consul in the Congo from 1901 to 1904, and he sent a most devastating report to the British government about the inhuman treatment, the barbaric exploitation of the indigenous people in what was then the Belgian Congo. Casement and Joseph Conrad shared quarters for a fortnight in the Congo in the 1890s, and Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness in 1902, familiar with the contents of Casement's report, even though this was not published until 1904. Both tried to describe the worst excesses of European brutality in the greedy colonization of Africa. T.S. Eliot read Conrad's work and wrote his poem from a corresponding place in his own beleaguered unconscious. Eliot was suffering at the time from what contemporary medical reports called a nervous breakdown. The original draft of The Wasteland had an epigraph taken directly from the last words of Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. Ezra Pound didn't think that Conrad cut the mustard and advised Eliot not to include the epigraph. Do you mean, Eliot replied to him in a letter, not to use the Conrad quote, or simply not to put Conrad's name to it? It is much the most appropriate I can find, he said. It is elucidative. they eventually decided to leave it out. So much did this cluster of poetry haunt the 20th century that in 1979 Francis Ford Coppola made a film called Apocalypse Now. And this film adapted The Heart of Darkness to a Vietnam War setting of the late 1960s. Shortly before Colonel Kurtz dies, he recites in the film part of T.S. Eliot's other poem, The Hollow Men. This poem carried the epigraph, Mr. Kurtz, he dead, a direct quote from Heart of Darkness. Apocalypse means revelation or disclosure, and poetry makes it happen now rather than then. All those poets would agree with W.B. Yeats. Only that which does not teach, which does not cry out, which does not persuade, which does not condescend, which does not explain, is irresistible. Overtly religious art or poetry, which is basically a form of preaching or teaching, fails to compel. Yeats was referring to John Millington Synge, who was a drifting, silent man, full of hidden passion and loved wild islands, because there, set out in the light of day, he saw what lay hidden in himself. The same might be said for John, the beloved disciple, on the island of Patmos, where he wrote his apocalypse, his book of Revelation. Synge wrote in his journal on the Aran Islands, "Last night, after walking in a dream among buildings with a strangely intense light on them, I heard a faint rhythm of music, beginning far away on some stringed instrument. It came closer to me, gradually increasing in quickness and volume with an irresistibly definite progression. When it was quite near, the sound began to move in my nerves and blood, and to urge me to dance with them. In a moment, I was swept away in a whirlwind of notes. My breath and my thoughts and every impulse of my body became a form of the dance, till I could not distinguish between the instruments and the rhythm and my own person or consciousness." Alexander Solzhenitsyn based his novel about life in a Russian concentration camp called The First Circle on the liturgy of Holy Week. When he received the Nobel Prize in 1970, he made a distinction between two kinds of artist, two kinds of poet. One artist sees himself as the creator of an independent spiritual world. He hoists onto his shoulders the task of creating this world, of peopling it, and of bearing the all-embracing responsibility for it. Another artist, recognizing a higher power above, gladly works as a humble apprentice beneath God's heaven. In a letter of 1895, Conrad admitted, "All my work is produced unconsciously, so to speak, and it isn't in me to improve what has got itself written. This kind of art is inspired. It comes from a depth where its authorship is no longer traceable. Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, puts it this way: "Then new events said to me, 'Don't move. A sublime generosity is coming towards you.' The chess master says nothing, rather than moving the silent chess piece. That I am part of the ploys of this game makes me amazingly happy." Poetry of this kind is not a tool or a technique. It is a way in which being, that which really is, can make its appearance. When we are trying to convey the being of a situation, we don't devise a language to do justice to it. We try to find the language which the situation demands. How do things appear as they really are? Not by devices of human making, even though they need our human cooperation. Poetry is a kind of making or doing which responds and recalls rather than represents or explains. Wallace Stevens makes a stab at describing what this might mean. It has to be living, to learn the speech of the place. It has to face the men of the time and meet the women of the time. It has to think about war, and it has to find what will suffice. It has to construct a new stage. It has to be on that stage and, like an insatiable actor, slowly and with meditation, speak words that in the ear, in the delicatest ear of the mind, repeat exactly that which it wants to hear, at the sound of which an invisible audience listens, not to the play, but to itself, expressed in an emotion as of two people, as of two emotions becoming one. The actor is a metaphysician in the dark, twanging an instrument, twanging a wiry string that gives sounds passing through sudden rightnesses, wholly containing the mind, below which it cannot descend, beyond which it has no will to rise. Anna Akhmatova wrote poetry of an equally searing quality in Russia during the 20th century. People have learned Russian simply to experience her poems in the original language. Born near the Black Sea in 1888, at a time when Russia still had Tsars, she lived a lifetime of upheaval and disaster. The October Revolution, the fall of Tsardom, the First World War. Her son Lev was imprisoned because of his personal connections. His arrest was one in a long line during Stalin's Great Purge. An estimated 600,000 people were killed. Despite, or perhaps because of these horrors, Akhmatova's creativity flourished. Her poems speak of surviving violence and uncertainty. From 1925, the government banned her works. Half harlot, half nun, the Soviet cultural policymakers sneered at her work. Her son was arrested again in 1949 and sentenced to 10 years hard labor in a Siberian prison camp. She died of heart failure at the age of 76. The following is an excerpt from her poem Requiem. I spent 17 months waiting in line outside the prison in Leningrad. One day, somebody in the crowd identified me. Standing behind me was a woman with lips blue from the cold, who had, of course, never heard me called by name before. Now she started out of the torpor common to us all, and asked me in a whisper. Everyone whispered here. Can you describe this? And I said, I can. Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face. Who knows, perhaps somewhere in the Ukraine at this moment, the great poem of the 21st century is being composed. The 20th day of March 2022, the third Sunday of Advent, is upon us because Christianity became the dominant force in Europe during the Middle Ages, and because Europe colonized most of the known world from the 15th to the 20th century, our way of measuring time and fixing calendars is dated from the birth of Jesus Christ, the arrival, we say, of God made man on earth. Up until quite recently, we spoke freely about BC and AD to describe the years before Christ came and the years of the Lord, Anno Domini, after he came, which take us to today, when Jesus Christ would have been 2022 years old. There are, of course, others who have always refused to accept such calculation. The Jewish people start their calendars from the creation of the world, as they understand that to have happened. The Muslims count from 622 of our era, when the Prophet Muhammad emigrated to Medina. Nowadays, however, most people on the planet follow the Christian calendar mostly for practical and commercial reasons. The estimation of Christ's time of death has been subject to debate for centuries. But the consensus seems to be, and few now would deny, the historical reality of his execution under Pontius Pilate, that Jesus died on 14 Nisan in the year 3793 Anno Mundi in the Jewish computation, which would be equivalent in our reckoning to Friday, April the 3rd, AD 33, at about 3 p.m., just a few hours before the beginning of Passover, the day of the Sabbath. These dates, during which Christianity remembers the events of Christ's last days on earth, are the focal point of our liturgical year and the culmination of the season of Lent. The word Lent itself probably comes from an Anglo-Saxon word for spring, which suggests the lengthening of days as we experience them. Originally, when the custom began and when it became established, which would have been around the 4th century, the Latin word quadragesima was used. Now that means 40, which was the number of days that Jesus spent fasting in the desert before he began his public ministry, which led to his death and his resurrection. Early Christians celebrated Easter when the Jews celebrated Passover, at the full moon after the spring equinox. Following the Council of Nicaea in 325, continental Christians began to place the equinox on March the 21st, while Celtic churches, who were further away, stuck with the date of March the 25th. Now, there has always been a practical move to establish the date of Easter in ways that would make it more predictable, to have a fixed date for Easter. And even our own conservative Celtic astronomer, Father Finton, has been tempted to vote for a fixed date so that he can get ready to sell his chocolates more conveniently and expeditiously on an open market. However, the majority still prefer to give the occasion a more poetic and lunar license. Whatever about the actual date, these last 3 days, what we have come to call the Sacred Triduum at the end of Holy Week, reenacting the 3 last days of Christ's life on earth, have become the focal point of our worship and our liturgy. And the carpet that we weave liturgically is designed from the template that's laid down in the Gospel accounts. Liturgy is always a retelling of Christ's story. The problems then multiply when we try to establish what exactly did he do and what are we supposed to do now to reenact what he did. For many years, for instance, several Filipinos are nailed to crosses on Good Friday, and penitents are scourged with glass-studded whips, while thousands of spectators watch under a hot sun as men are nailed and hoisted onto 15-foot crosses 50 miles north of Manila. The Filipino Christs, accompanied by horse-riding men dressed as Roman centurions, parade for at least a mile from the village chapel to the mound, surrounded by barbed wire in the middle of a rice paddy, with chants of "Crucify them, crucify them." In 2019, Ruben Eneje, who was playing the role of Jesus Christ, was crucified for the 33rd time on Good Friday. Since the 1980s, Ruben, who's now age 60, has been nailed to a cross on Good Friday in front of crowds of locals and tourists in a village north of Manila. Now, he attaches great significance to this 33rd time because, according to the Bible, Jesus was 33 years old at the time of his crucifixion. Now, this is all part of a controversial Easter tradition of doing this in memory of him. But who are we to despise such literal practices? Listen to a poem called Easter Liturgy. A pride of males aged 70 to 7, vested in esoteric dignity, enact the archaic patriarchal rite. They bow to each other's self-importance, incense each other's flame-aureoled heads, pace in the spotlight, graciously dispense mysteries they do not understand. Beneath their jeweled robes and snowy skirts, their boots trample the sanctuary. They have blessed armies, instruments of torture, with the same perfumed ceremonial. Where were they but for one atypical lover, when women, pierced by pain but strong in grief, knowing in their own flesh the pangs of birth, the greater anguish when this hard-won life was wrested from their arms, stood in endurance at that hideous deathbed, or braved authority to bathe with tears, anoint with fragrant love that so dishonored body lit by the dawn. Taking the complete panorama of evidence and reconstructing the original happening, we agree that the night before he died, Christ gathered his disciples around him, and while they were having their ritual evening meal as practicing Jews, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body." Then, in the same way, taking the cup of wine, he blessed it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my blood." Then he further instructed them, "Do this in memory of me." Now, it is of interest that the words he used in the original Greek text are tuto poiete. And this verb, poiete, to do, also gives the etymology for the word poiesis, which is poetry. The activity by which a person brings something into being that did not exist before. And I am reliably informed by our resident biblical scholar, Father Luke, that the same verb is used for describing the activity of God in the work of creation recorded in the book of Genesis. Now, later on, of course, with hindsight and in retrospect, the disciples who were present and those who were not began to read into this seminal event, which came to be known as the Last Supper, all kinds of significance, most of which stemmed from the horrific outcome of that Thursday evening meal, when the presider was handed over to the authorities, tortured and crucified. It became clear that the actions he had performed the previous evening were ritual ones, whereby he was giving us his body and blood as a way of communicating with us beyond the reality of his impending death. And later again, the followers of Christ realized that the meal during which Christ performed this series of actions was a Jewish liturgical celebration, a Paschal meal, a ritual remembrance of the salvation of the Jewish people from the hands of their Egyptian masters, the original exodus from slavery to freedom. This Passover from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land was and is a form of poetry also. There are no Egyptian records of this great escape, and it is hardly ever likely that Moses met the Pharaoh of Egypt. I recall that when our President Michael D. Higgins was visiting the Queen of England, George Hook, who you may remember, was reporting on one occasion on News Talk, and he said, "I am very, very happy that our President is visiting the Queen of England today in Buckingham Palace. Time was he wouldn't have been allowed into the kitchen." And something similar might have been said about the Hebrew slaves in the court of Pharaoh. These so-called biblical accounts of proceedings are told from the point of view of the underlings. They form poetic writings about historical realities by scribes from tribes who are doing the narrating. Things that happen locally and incidentally become magnified and enlarged to form templates of heroic achievement. The Great Escape, we have about 7 stories that are continually repeated in every culture, everywhere. The Great Escape, the fight against the dragon, from rags to riches. These archetypal stories begin as unremarkable biography. And as each one of us inhabits time and space, our movement from the womb to the outside world, from the dining room to the drawing room, from home to school, from native land to foreign shores, these take on these archetypal proportions and form the basis of our most extravagant accounts of journeys that we have made, whether as Wanderly Wagon through the prairie or as Star Trek through the galaxies. Lent is a period of remembering how Judeo-Christianity emerged from the Exodus. Exodus became the identifying myth, the defining symbol of humanity's march towards freedom. Before that original event, there was no people of God. Nothing but a scattering of disconnected people with no history, no reality, no identity. The Exodus became the founding myth, the liturgical contour, the poetic genesis of the historical people. And even the account of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis, experts tell us, is a retrospective projection of the contours of the Exodus experience onto the imagined emergence of the cosmos from chaos. Martin Buber, himself a great thinking Jew, describes the possible emergence of the original Paschal liturgy, the way in which the Exodus was celebrated liturgically, as follows. Favorable circumstances have, within a relatively brief period, provided a man possessing the character and destiny of a leader with the external prerequisites for the fulfillment of his immediate task, the leading of a group of semi-nomadic tribes out of the land of bondage. We do not know, he says, where the pursuers caught up with the fugitives, whether in the neighbourhood of the present Suez Canal, or further north at one of the Bitter Lakes, or at the Gulf of Aqaba. Wherever it may have happened, however, there begins a natural process, or a series of natural processes, leading to the saving of the one and the downfall of the other. What is decisive with respect to the inner history of humankind is that the children of Israel understood this to be an act of their God, a miracle. And this perception at that fateful hour, which is assuredly to be attributed largely to the personal influence of Moses, had a decisive influence on the coming into being of what is called Israel in the religious history of humanity. Miracle, he says, is not something supernatural or super-historical. Miracle is simply what happens insofar as it meets people who are capable of receiving it or prepared to receive it as miracle. What is vital is only that what happened was experienced by them while it happened as the act of God. When the dew lifted from the desert, they saw a thing delicate, powdery, as thin as hoarfrost on the ground, and they said to one another, "What is that?" "That," said Moses, "is the bread the Lord gives you to eat." They were puzzled and disappointed, and they called it manhu, which means, "What is that?" God never told them what it was, except that this mysterious thing was to be their desert food, their viaticum, until they reached the promised land. It was like coriander seed, white in colour, and resembled wafers made with honey. Commentators say that manna was a natural event, a secretion from insects which live in tamarisk trees. Manna typifies the spiritual nourishment essential for successful journeying through the wilderness. Jesus claimed to be its fulfillment. "I am the bread of life." It was not Moses who gave you bread from heaven. It was my Father, and this bread gives life to the world. I will end there. Amen.